Despite being set up in the most obvious way that they could possibly get away with back in Season 3, the relationship between Marceline and Princess Bubblegum largely takes a backseat for the first 2/3 of the show. After what was missing, the next 3 seasons only has a single episode actually focused on the pair with Sky Witch, and a few tiny interactions spread throughout episodes like Time Sandwich or Princess Day. However, at some point around the beginning of the show's 7th season, Adventure Time decided to fully commit to the rekindling of the pair's past romance, which kicks off with the 2nd episode of the season, Varmints, and that's what we're talking about today. In this video, we're going to go through the episode and talk about how, by utilizing the state of Princess Bubblegum after the events of the previous season, Varmints explores both how Bonnie and Marcy have changed since their past relationship, and how those changes ultimately let them move past what caused them to drift apart, allowing the pair to grow even closer than ever before.
Give us a minute, Peppermint Butler.
From the beginning of the episode, as Marcy hums "I'm Just Your Problem" on the way to the Candy Kingdom, Varmint immediately begins to highlight the ways that both of its central characters have drastically changed since they were together, with Marcy stumbling upon the information that the King of Ooh has throne-jacked PB 2 months ago, and that Bonnie just didn't tell her. The King is great in the scene, by the way, but back to Marcy. I think it's really interesting how she chooses to react to this information, as while she does get angry, she manages to keep that anger to a physical minimum, and she just leaves the new princess mostly alone, whereas the Marcy of the past probably would have thrown him out the window that she flew in through. Back at PB's cabin, while Marceline does fly in pretty hot, she immediately cools down once Bonnie admits that the reason that she didn't tell her about what happened was because she was embarrassed, and is still just trying to figure out what the next chunk of her life looks like. The PB of this quarter hour, with a snapback and backed by snappy country-esque instrumentals, lets us see the character through a really fascinating lens, and one that we likely never would have gotten a chance to see if Finn was the one accompanying her throughout this episode. As she explains her current predicament, guarding her perfectly crafted pumpkin citizens from the episode's titular varmints, we get a glimpse into the types of conversations that the pair share when they hang out in between episodes, something implied to be a pretty frequent occurrence by this point in the series. Eventually, we do get to finally take a look at the creatures that have been bothering the newly formed Garden Kingdom, and man, do they have such a great design. I'm skipping a little bit ahead here, but everything about these little dudes, including their eventual mother Varmint, is done so well to effectively use such a cool design, and the way that they're animated to just creep around is perfect. Eventually, our pair make their way to the well-named Varmint hole, and after PB's gun hilariously goes into battery mode and allows her to power her flashlight, we make it to the main location that will make up the majority of the episode. Besides just being a visually well done place, the candy mines also serve as a representation of the pair's past relationship, and everything that they've gone through since then. While they explore the caves, Marcy and PB continue to stumble upon evidence of their past adventures, which cause them to recall both the good and the bad memories from that period of their lives. One of my favorite little moments of bubblegum characterization in this one is when the pair approach the bridge that Bonnie once jumped over in order to, quote, prove something, but now just uses her scientific gadgets to easily hover over. At this point in their relationship, there's no use for either of these characters to try and pretend to the other that they are something that they aren't, as they've simply spent just too much time together. Throughout the little bit of peace in the middle of this episode, we get the first hint towards Peeb's eventual breakdown at the end of this one, as she admits to Marcy the overwhelming feeling of her kingdom growing and taking more and more time to the point of it becoming nearly impossible to handle. Something something that Marcy interprets as an excuse for why their relationship fizzled out, and something the episode takes a bit of an action break before getting back to. Speaking of which, the little fight scene against the mother varmint during this episode is the only true piece of action in it, and it's really well done. Besides just having some neat choreography that takes advantage of the setting and the combatants and such, we also get another less dialogue heavy look into Marcy and PB's chemistry as the pair fight together like two people who really know each other. Best represented with this great gag of Bonnie splitting her gun into two as if she was going to share, only for her to dual wield while Marcy just transforms into a beast. Speaking of that last transformation, there is a ton of shape-shifting from Marceline throughout this episode, and while the last bit of it that they're setting up here ultimately ends up feeling strangely convenient and a bit of a stretch for season 7, no pun intended, every design of the beastly creature accompanying her still humanoid pink princess is both sick and hilarious. After the beast begins to dominate our pair, taking PB's hat in the process, the closest thing she still has to a crown, they're forced to take refuge in a small hole, where the breakdown of their past continues to unravel. Marcy quickly spots the one time she ever got PB to graffiti any of her own property, but by the time that she tries to turn around to jokingly taunt her about it, Bonnie is already starting to sob about the loss of her hat, the physical representation of her inability to even take control of and protect a dozen or so pumpkins. Well, we've seen Bonnie get so invested with work that she's pushed people away multiple times throughout the series. It's really interesting to see her admit it here, and especially the way that she ties it in with her treatment of Marcy. Immediately after seeing this, Marcy apologizes for any part she had in upsetting PB, and quickly tries to calm her down so that the pair can escape their impending doom, offering to take some of the burden off of her by being the one who's prepared for this disaster. Marcy's plan to burrow out of the mines does unfortunately involve destroying PB's tag, which represents the past relationship between the pair, but ultimately Bonnie seems more than willing to let it go, allowing her and Marcy to both leave the mines and the weight of their past relationship behind. This whole scene is really well done, as we get to see a side of both characters that we've never quite gotten before, with a completely open PB and a completely understanding Marcy. The final few moments of this episode consist of this incredibly short back and forth between the pair on the porch of the cabin, but it still genuinely has some of my favorite lines of the episode, including this one.
I'm crazy tired, Marceline. I think I have been for a long time.
And while we get to watch some really beautiful and adorable and beautifully adorable shots here, we get a sense that even if this episode doesn't give her back her kingdom or even fix her varmint problem, that finally telling Marcy about everything that she's been going through will more than be worth the temporary struggle.
Can I come back now?
While it's very easy to get caught up in the Bubbleline moments throughout this one, it's worth saying that this episode's biggest strength, and what ultimately makes it so fantastic, is how it uses this dynamic between these two characters to get Bubblegum to open up about everything that she's been going through. And it's this underlying feeling that Princess Bubblegum is working through throughout this episode that I'm going to spend the majority of the remainder of this video talking about, which is the idea that she's made so many sacrifices, such as pushing people away and stressing out 24/7, in order to try and run a kingdom that ultimately ended up kicking her out anyway. The feeling of regret that Peebs has for putting all of her energy into one goal that ultimately exploded and left her with a bunch of shattered relationships is what Marcy is peeling back throughout this entire episode, in a way that the Marceline of old could just never really do. Given where the character was throughout her first few appearances in the show, there really wasn't any option for Marceline to do anything but get more empathetic. but it really is fascinating just how gentle she is with an obviously mentally fragile Princess Bubblegum throughout this episode. There are multiple times in this episode where Marcy will make a joke about PB in a way that's consistent with how the character acts in uncomfortable situations throughout the show. And even when PB's mindset causes her to objectively overreact to this, Marceline is immediately willing to try and take the blame to make things better. And it's this approach that ultimately leads to the rekindling of their relationship in the back half of the show. Even all the way back in What Was Missing, the show makes it pretty clear that it's the lack of honesty and the lack of openness between the pair that's causing them to remain apart when both of them would rather be together. And it's this softer approach by Marcy, as seen in this episode, that ultimately gets PB to be open about everything troubling her as every aspect of her life falls apart, leaving her to build it all back up again. In more ways than one, this episode is somewhat of a mini reverse stakes, as in about a dozen or so episodes, we'll get to see Bubblegum help Marcy work through her issues, a saga that ultimately ends with PB getting her kingdom back. Despite both of these characters being varying degrees of a mess throughout the series, it's often hidden by their exterior, as Marcy's grief is hidden by her outward aloofness, and Bonnie is constantly attempting to hide her stress behind a facade of preparation. But when the two of them finally come back together, after both changing for the better in their time apart, they're able to share their struggle with somebody else, something that Varmints does a fantastic job demonstrating, even if they aren't allowed to explicitly be together for a few more seasons. Anyway, that's about it for me. If you want to tell me how awful this video was in a way that's harder to ignore than the comments, you can find me wasting away on Twitter somewhere in the description. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in about a week with a video that feels very similar to this one. Thanks for watching.